The silence was wrong. That much Alan Turing knew with absolute certainty as he stood in the frigid darkness of Hut 8 at Bletchley Park on February 1st, 1942, at precisely 3:17 in the morning, staring at the teleprinter that had been producing decrypted German naval messages every few hours for the past 18 months, but now sat completely dead and silent. The machine wasn't broken or malfunctioning. Its mechanical components were functioning perfectly, but no decoded U-boat transmissions had emerged for the past 6 hours, leaving only blank paper spooling through the mechanism as if the entire German U-boat fleet had simply vanished from the electromagnetic spectrum. This wasn't necessarily unusual in the cryptographic war that Bletchley Park had been fighting since the beginning of the conflict, because sometimes the Germans changed their daily key settings in ways that required additional time to break, taking a few hours or occasionally longer, depending on the complexity of the settings and the availability of cribs, those guessed message fragments that provided entry points for the bomb machines to begin their systematic testing of possible rotor positions. Turing's team of cryptanalysts working in Hut 8 had grown accustomed to these delays as part of their routine, accepting them as inevitable friction in the intelligence war. But something about tonight felt fundamentally different in ways that Turing couldn't quite articulate but recognized through the mathematical intuition that had made him one of Britain's most brilliant minds. He walked slowly to the bomb machines, those remarkable electromechanical computers that had been designed specifically to break the Enigma cipher through systematic testing of rotor combinations, observing all 8 of them running continuously with their distinctive clicking and whirring sounds as they spun through thousands of possible key combinations per minute in their tireless search for the daily settings that would unlock German naval communications. The machines should have found something by this point in their processing cycles, should have cracked at least one message from the dozens of intercepted transmissions that had been fed into them for analysis, but nothing had emerged from any of the 8 bombs despite their continuous operation. All 8 churning through combinations, and all 8 producing absolutely nothing of value. Peter Twin, one of Turing's most trusted deputies, and a cryptanalyst who'd been working on German codes since before the war, approached with an expression that combined exhaustion with something darker, something closer to dread, as he carried an intercept that had just arrived from one of Britain's signal intelligence stations scattered around the coastline. The man looked like he hadn't slept in days, which was probably accurate given the intensity of their work, and his voice carried an edge of concern as he handed the paper to Turing and suggested that they might have a serious problem developing. The intercept was a German naval transmission, encrypted in the familiar patterns of Enigma cipher, but the message structure was immediately and obviously different from what they'd been seeing for months, with a longer preamble and different formatting that suggested fundamental changes to the underlying encryption system rather than simple variations in key settings. Turing studied the transmission with the focused intensity that characterized his approach to mathematical problems, counting characters and performing mental arithmetic with the speed that had always amazed his colleagues. And as the implications became clear, his face went pale in the dim lighting of the hut. The Germans had added another rotor to their Enigma machines, transforming the 3-rotor system that Bletchley Park had learned to break with reasonable consistency into a 4-rotor system that multiplied the complexity exponentially and rendered their existing methods effectively useless. Twin confirmed Turing's analysis, noting that the message structure strongly suggested 4-rotor Enigma, rather than the 3-rotor version they'd been fighting for years, and the implications of this development were nothing short of catastrophic for Britain's intelligence operations and ultimately for the entire war effort in the Atlantic. The mathematics were brutally simple and impossibly daunting, because 3-rotor Enigma had 17,576 possible rotor positions, a large number, but one that was fundamentally manageable, given sufficient computing resources, with the bombs capable of testing all possible combinations in approximately 20 hours of continuous operation. Four-rotor Enigma, by contrast, had 456,976 possible positions, representing a 26-fold increase in complexity that meant the bombs, even running at full capacity with all 8 machines operating continuously, would require weeks to test all combinations and possibly months if the Germans had also modified other aspects of their encryption procedures. By the time Bletchley Park managed to crack one day's messages using brute force testing of all possible rotor positions, the Germans would have changed their daily keys as they did every midnight, rendering the laboriously obtained intelligence completely worthless and outdated, useless for the operational purposes that had made ultra-intelligence so valuable to British naval commanders trying to route convoys around concentrations of U-boats in the North Atlantic. Turing picked up the telephone and called Commander Edward Travis, the director of Bletchley Park, waking him from sleep at 3:30 in the morning, because the situation demanded immediate attention from the highest levels of British intelligence. And when Travis answered, Turing delivered the devastating news without preamble or softening. The Germans had changed their naval Enigma system by adding a 4th rotor, Turing explained with characteristic directness. And this modification had rendered Bletchley Park completely blind to U-boat communications, with every submarine transmission now unreadable using their existing methods and machinery. There was a long pause on the line as Travis absorbed the implications of what he was hearing, understanding immediately that Britain had just lost its most valuable intelligence source in the Battle of the Atlantic, before he asked the critical question that would determine how naval operations proceeded in the coming weeks and months. How long would it take to break the new 4-rotor system? Travis asked, and Turing performed rapid calculations in his mind before delivering an answer that was honest but devastating, estimating that they would need weeks or possibly months to develop new methods and build faster bombs capable of handling the increased complexity. They would need to capture a 4-rotor machine physically if possible, or develop significantly faster computing methods, or achieve extraordinary luck in finding exploitable weaknesses in German operating procedures. But until one of those things happened, they would have absolutely no access to U-boat communications and no ability to predict where submarines would be operating or when they would attack Allied convoys. Travis absorbed this information for a moment before stating that he would inform the Admiralty immediately and instructing Turing to do whatever was necessary, to work miracles if that's what the situation required, because the alternative was unthinkable. And then the line went dead, leaving Turing holding the receiver in the silence of Hut 8. He hung up slowly and looked at Twin with an expression that combined determination with the grim awareness of what they were facing, stating the obvious truth that they had just lost the most important intelligence source in the Atlantic, noting that every convoy routing decision for the past 18 months had relied fundamentally on knowing where U-boats were positioned, and that now they were operating blind without that crucial information. Twin asked quietly how many ships Turing thought would die before they managed to crack the new system, and Turing didn't answer immediately because he was already performing calculations in his mind based on previous sinking rates from before Bletchley Park had started reading U-boat messages successfully, before convoys could be routed intelligently around Wolfpack concentrations, and the number he arrived at was genuinely horrifying. Thousands of ships would likely be lost, representing millions of tons of shipping capacity, and tens of thousands of sailors would die in the cold waters of the Atlantic, all because the Germans had added one additional rotor to their encryption machines, and there was nothing Turing could do in the immediate term except work harder, try every possible approach, and hope that they would find a solution before the losses became unsustainable. The Enigma Blackout had begun, and for the next 10 months Britain would fight the Battle of the Atlantic effectively blind, unable to read the communications that had been giving them such a decisive advantage, and the consequences would be measured in ships sunk and lives lost on a scale that threatened to undermine the entire Allied war effort. To understand the full magnitude of what happened when Germany introduced four-rotor Enigma in February 1942, it's necessary to understand what had come before, the intelligence war and cryptographic battle that had been raging for 2 years and had given Britain a crucial edge in the submarine conflict that was threatening to strangle British supply lines. In 1940, after months of intensive work that had required captured codebooks from U-33 and U-110, along with mathematical genius from Turing and his team of cryptanalysts, Bletchley Park had successfully cracked the three-rotor German naval Enigma, achieving a breakthrough that immediately and dramatically impacted the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. By May 1941, they were reading U-boat traffic regularly and with reasonable consistency, decrypting messages that revealed submarine positions, patrol areas, attack plans, and operational orders, intelligence that was immediately passed to the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, where it was used to route convoys around known concentrations of U-boats. The impact of this intelligence breakthrough was immediate and devastating to German submarine operations, with convoy losses dropping dramatically as ships were routed intelligently around patrol areas and escorts could be concentrated where attacks were most likely to occur. Before Enigma had been cracked, convoy losses had averaged 12% of ships, meaning one vessel in every 8 failed to reach its destination, falling victim to U-boat torpedoes in the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic, where submarines hunted in wolf packs, coordinated by Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters. But after Enigma decryption became routine, losses dropped to approximately 4%, meaning only one ship in 25 was being sunk, a reduction that saved hundreds of vessels and thousands of lives while preserving the shipping capacity that Britain desperately needed to continue fighting. The U-boat commanders began noticing this dramatic change in convoy behavior, reporting to Admiral Dönitz that Allied convoys seemed to be avoiding them with uncanny precision, changing course at exactly the right moments, as if British naval commanders possessed perfect knowledge of where German submarines were positioned. Dönitz, who was both brilliant and paranoid about security, immediately suspected some form of intelligence compromise and ordered comprehensive investigations, checking for spies within the U-boat command structure, reviewing radio procedures for potential security weaknesses, and examining the Enigma encryption system itself to determine whether it might have been penetrated by British intelligence. German cryptographers provided reassurances that were both technically accurate and dangerously wrong, assuring Dönitz that Enigma was mathematically unbreakable, given the astronomical number of possible key combinations, arguing that even if the British somehow captured an intact machine, they would still need the daily key settings, which changed every midnight, and concluding that the convoy evasions must be explained by other factors such as improved radar capabilities, better direction-finding technology, or simply good luck on the part of Allied naval commanders. Dönitz accepted these assurances mostly because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. But he wasn't entirely satisfied and ordered additional security measures anyway, including the development of a more secure Enigma variant, specifically designed for U-boat communications that would incorporate an additional rotor to increase the system's complexity exponentially. The four-rotor Enigma, designated M4 by the German Navy, required 18 months of development from initial concept to operational deployment, and by January 1942, the new machines were ready for distribution to all operational U-boats in the Atlantic Fleet. On February 1, 1942, the Kriegsmarine executed a carefully planned transition, switching from three-rotor to four-rotor Enigma for all submarine communications simultaneously, and just like that, with a single coordinated change in encryption procedures, Bletchley Park went completely blind to German submarine operations, and Britain lost the intelligence advantage that had been saving hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. The consequences of this cryptographic blackout were immediate, catastrophic, and measurable in very precise terms through the grim statistics of merchant shipping losses that escalated dramatically in the months following the German encryption upgrade. In January 1942, the month before the blackout began, 62 merchant ships totaling 327,000 tons had been sunk in the Atlantic, losses that were significant but manageable given Britain's shipping resources and the rate of new construction in American shipyards. But in February 1942, the first full month of the blackout, when Bletchley Park was unable to read U-boat communications, 85 ships totaling 476,000 tons went to the bottom, representing a 37% increase in losses that immediately alarmed British naval commanders and politicians, who understood that shipping capacity was the critical constraint determining whether Britain could continue fighting. The losses continued to escalate through the spring and summer of 1942, as German U-boat operations became increasingly effective in the absence of British signals intelligence, with 95 ships totaling 537,000 tons sunk in March, 74 ships and 431,000 tons in April, 125 ships and 607,000 tons in May, and 144 ships totaling 700,000 tons in June. These losses were fundamentally unsustainable because Britain was losing merchant vessels faster than they could be built in British shipyards and faster than America, now fully engaged in the war following Pearl Harbor, could replace them through emergency shipbuilding programs. And if the trend continued for much longer, Britain would literally run out of ships capable of importing the food, fuel, raw materials, and military equipment necessary to continue the war. Admiral Sir Max Horton, who commanded Western approaches and was responsible for protecting convoys crossing the Atlantic, described the situation as fighting completely blind, because every convoy routing decision had become pure guesswork, without intelligence about U-boat positions, making evasive routing impossible and forcing convoys to sail into wolf-pack concentrations repeatedly through sheer bad luck. The U-boat commanders, who had no idea that their previous difficulties had been caused by British code-breaking rather than improved anti-submarine technology, called this period the Second Happy Time, considering it even more successful than their initial operations in mid-1940, because now they had more submarines available, better tactical coordination, and the British seemed mysteriously unable to avoid them, despite having more escorts and better equipment than earlier in the war. Dönitz deployed 40 operational U-boats in a patrol line stretching across the North Atlantic convoy routes, creating a barrier 400 miles long with approximately 20 miles between individual boats, ensuring that every convoy attempting to cross the Atlantic would have to pass through this patrol line somewhere and face nearly certain detection by at least one submarine. Once a convoy was detected, the wolf-pack tactics that Dönitz had perfected would swing into action, with radio calls and homing signals bringing 15 to 20 U-boats converging on a single convoy from multiple directions, attacking at night on the surface where submarines were fastest and hardest to detect with existing sonar technology. And the resulting slaughter was immense, with individual convoys sometimes losing a quarter or more of their ships in sustained attacks lasting several nights. Bletchley Park worked with desperate intensity throughout this period, running 3 shifts of cryptanalysts 24 hours a day, with every available person assigned to breaking the four-rotor Enigma system, Turing's bombs running continuously, and testing millions of combinations while searching for any patterns or weaknesses that might provide entry points for decryption. The additional rotor in the German system had exponentially increased the key space in ways that made the problem fundamentally more difficult than anything they had tackled before. And without physical captures of four-rotor machines or codebooks, progress was nearly impossible, despite the brilliant mathematicians and dedicated workers throwing themselves at the problem. They attempted every cryptographic technique available to them, including statistical analysis of message characteristics, known plaintext attacks based on predicted message content, frequency analysis of character distributions, and the development of cribs based on German operational procedures and message formats. But nothing produced the breakthrough they desperately needed, because the four-rotor system was simply too complex and too secure, given the computational resources available to them. By April 1942, with losses mounting and pressure increasing from military and political leaders who understood that Britain's survival was at stake, Turing composed a carefully worded but urgent memo to Winston Churchill explaining that they faced an intelligence crisis where every day of delay cost lives. And while they needed more resources, including additional bombs, more staff, and more intercept stations, most critically, they needed physical captures of four-rotor machines or codebooks, or any materials that might provide the entry points necessary for breaking the new system. Churchill, who understood the strategic importance of signals intelligence better than most politicians, responded immediately by allocating additional resources, ordering the construction of new bombs specifically designed for four-rotor Enigma that would operate faster and more efficiently than the original machines, authorizing the recruitment of more staff with mathematics departments at Cambridge and Oxford being systematically raided for talented graduates and professors who might contribute to the cryptographic war. But physical captures remained the critical bottleneck because you couldn't simply order the Royal Navy to capture an intact U-boat with its encryption equipment undestroyed, since submarines were elusive targets that tended to sink quickly when attacked or escape into the depths where they couldn't be pursued, making the capture of an intact boat with its Enigma machine and codebook still secured an outcome that required either extraordinary circumstances or extraordinary bravery on the part of whoever attempted it. The breakthrough finally came on October 30th, 1942, during an engagement in the Eastern Mediterranean, where HMS Petard, a British destroyer, attacked and damaged U-559 sufficiently to force the submarine to surface with its crew abandoning ship in the darkness. Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier made the decision, without orders and without fully understanding the implications, to board the sinking submarine and attempt to retrieve any documents or equipment they could find before the boat went down, climbing down through the conning tower into compartments that were already flooding, while the submarine settled lower in the water with each passing minute. They worked frantically in the darkness and rising water, locating the radio room and finding codebooks and cipher materials that they passed up through the conning tower to NAFI canteen assistant Tommy Brown, a 16-year-old boy who had also volunteered to help with the boarding operation. And they continued working even as the water rose higher and the submarine began its final plunge, retrieving documents until the very last moment when the boat went down so quickly that Fasson and Grazier were trapped inside and drowned. Their bodies never recovered from the wreckage that settled on the seafloor hundreds of feet below. The documents they had retrieved at the cost of their lives proved to be exactly what Bletchley Park needed, including codebooks and procedural materials for four-rotor Enigma that provided the cribs and entry points that Turing's team had been desperately seeking for 8 months. The materials were rushed to Bletchley Park, where crypt analysts immediately began analyzing them and developing new attack methods based on the information contained in the captured documents. And within weeks, they had achieved their first successful decryptions of four-rotor Enigma messages, breaking the blackout that had lasted since February and restoring Britain's ability to read German submarine communications. The first successful decrypt came on December 13, 1942, when one of the new four-rotor bombs completed an 18-hour run testing combinations using cribs derived from the captured codebooks and produced a possible solution for that day's key settings. Joan Clark, one of Turing's senior cryptanalysts, who had been working the overnight shift, ran a test decryption using the proposed solution and watched as clear German text emerged from the cipher. A routine U-boat position report and weather observation that would normally be completely unremarkable, except that it represented the first readable German submarine transmission in 10 months. She immediately telephoned Turing at his home, waking him from sleep to deliver the news that they had broken four-rotor Enigma and were reading U-boat traffic again after 10 months of being blind. And Turing's response combined exhaustion with profound relief as he asked how long it would take to decrypt the backlog of intercepted messages that had been accumulating. Clark estimated it would take days or possibly a week to work through the accumulated traffic, but they could begin reading current transmissions immediately, meaning that convoy routing could once again be based on accurate intelligence about U-boat positions rather than guesswork, and Turing instructed her to inform the Admiralty immediately that ultra-intelligence was operational again. The impact of breaking four-rotor Enigma was as dramatic as the original breakthrough with three-rotor systems had been, with convoy losses dropping significantly as routes could once again be planned intelligently to avoid known patrol areas, and escorts could be concentrated where attacks were most likely to occur. After the blackout ended in December 1942, convoys could be routed around wolfpack concentrations, anti-submarine patrols could be coordinated effectively, and the strategic balance in the Atlantic began shifting decisively in favor of the Allies, with U-boat losses increasing while merchant shipping losses declined steadily through 1943 and into 1944. By 1943, Germany was clearly losing the Battle of the Atlantic despite having more submarines available than ever before. Not because Allied navies possessed superior technology in anti-submarine warfare, though technologies like radar and sonar had improved significantly, and not because there were more escort ships or aircraft available for convoy protection, though numbers had increased, but fundamentally because Britain could read German submarine communications again and use that intelligence to avoid U-boats or hunt them down, depending on operational requirements. The cryptographic war would continue until 1945, with new systems and new challenges and new breakthroughs on both sides. But the 10-month blackout represented the most dangerous crisis in British signals intelligence during the entire war, the period when Britain came closest to losing the intelligence advantage that had become so critical to survival. There's a cruel arithmetic to the Enigma Blackout that historians have calculated in various ways, attempting to quantify how many lives were saved by breaking Enigma systems and how many were lost during the periods when decryption wasn't possible. The estimates suggest that if Bletchley Park had never cracked Enigma at all, neither the three-rotor version broken in 1941 nor the four-rotor version broken in late 1942, and the war had continued with convoy losses at pre-ultra rates throughout 1942 and beyond. Britain would have lost approximately 1,200 merchant ships in 1942 alone, compared to the actual total of 609 ships lost during the blackout months and far fewer during the months when Enigma was readable. Over the entire course of the war, ultra-intelligence is estimated to have saved 1,500 to 2,000 merchant ships from being sunk by U-boats, representing somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 lives that would have been lost if German submarine communications had remained unreadable throughout the conflict. But during the 10-month blackout specifically, from February through November 1942, approximately 322 additional ships were lost compared to the previous 10 months when Enigma was being read successfully, representing perhaps 4,000 additional deaths that occurred directly because Bletchley Park couldn't decrypt four-rotor Enigma messages. Those 4,000 men died in the darkness and the cold of the North Atlantic, torpedoed by submarines they never saw coming, drowning in oil-slicked water, or freezing in lifeboats, or going down with their ships in explosions that killed instantly, not because British intelligence failed in any general sense, but because the Germans upgraded their encryption system by adding one rotor, changing one variable in the cryptographic equation, and for 10 months Britain was blind to submarine movements and unable to protect the convoys that were keeping the nation alive. The story has a postscript that continues to haunt intelligence historians and cryptographers, a question about whether Bletchley Park could have broken four-rotor Enigma faster and shortened the blackout that cost so many lives. The answer appears to be probably yes. They could have broken the system faster if certain things had been different, if more resources had been allocated earlier, if additional bombs had been available sooner, if physical captures had happened months earlier rather than in October 1942. The capture of codebooks from U-549 was absolutely critical to the eventual breakthrough, but it was fundamentally a matter of luck that the submarine was damaged in a way that allowed boarding, that Fasson and Grazier made the decision to enter the sinking boat, that they found the right documents before the submarine went down, and that Tommy Brown survived to pass those documents up from inside the conning tower. If the capture hadn't happened at all, or if it had happened differently with different documents retrieved, or the submarine sinking too quickly for anything to be recovered, the blackout might have lasted months longer, extending into mid-1943, or possibly even later depending on whether alternative breaks could have been achieved through pure cryptographic analysis. If that had occurred, if the blackout had extended into 1943, Britain's shipping losses would likely have become genuinely unsustainable, making Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, potentially impossible due to insufficient shipping capacity and inadequate escort resources, fundamentally altering the strategic trajectory of the entire war. The entire Allied strategy in Europe depended fundamentally on winning the Battle of the Atlantic and maintaining the sea lanes that allowed Britain to import supplies from America and project military power across the Mediterranean and eventually into occupied Europe. And winning the Battle of the Atlantic depended absolutely on reading Enigma communications to know where U-boats were operating. For 10 months that advantage disappeared completely, and Britain came extraordinarily close to losing the shipping war that would have made continuing the fight impossible, saved ultimately not by superior strategy or better technology or more numerous forces, but by two sailors who drowned while retrieving documents from a sinking submarine. Anthony Fasson and Colin Grazier were posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for bravery, recognizing that their sacrifice in retrieving codebooks while the submarine sank beneath them gave Bletchley Park the tools necessary to break four-rotor Enigma and end the blackout that was costing thousands of lives. They never knew what they had accomplished, never learned that the documents they died retrieving would help restore British signals intelligence capabilities, help save thousands of subsequent lives, and help win the Battle of the Atlantic and ultimately the entire war, because they drowned inside U-559 as it plunged toward the sea floor. But they understood that the documents were important enough to risk their lives for, and ultimately to die for. And they were absolutely right about that assessment. though they never lived to see the proof of their judgment or receive the recognition they deserved for making the choice to board a sinking enemy submarine in darkness to retrieve papers they couldn't read but understood were valuable. The Enigma Blackout remains a forgotten crisis in many popular histories of World War II, overshadowed by more dramatic and cinematically compelling moments like the Battle of Midway or the Siege of Stalingrad or D-Day or the atomic bombings of Japan. But for 10 months from February to December 1942, the outcome of the entire war hung in the balance, not on any battlefield or in any political negotiation, but in a cryptographic struggle fought in the huts of Bletchley Park and the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Germany upgraded Enigma, adding a fourth rotor that multiplied the system's complexity exponentially, and Britain went blind, unable to read the submarine communications that had been giving them such a decisive advantage in routing convoys and directing escorts. Ships died by the hundreds, thousands of sailors perished in the cold Atlantic waters, and Britain's ability to continue fighting came into genuine question as shipping losses mounted beyond sustainable levels. But then, Bletchley Park fought back with the determination and brilliance that characterized the entire Ultra operation, working miracles of cryptographic analysis, building faster bombs capable of handling the increased complexity, capturing critical documents at terrible cost, and ultimately breaking the unbreakable four-rotor system. They won the cryptographic battle, not permanently or completely, because the intelligence war continued until the very end of the conflict in 1945, with new systems and new challenges and new breakthroughs on both sides. But they ended the blackout and brought the lights back on and made U-boats visible again to British intelligence, allowing Britain to survive and keep fighting and keep supplying the war effort and keep the Atlantic sea lanes open for the convoys that carried the materials and equipment necessary for eventual victory. All of this was accomplished because mathematicians and crypt analysts at Bletchley Park refused to give up despite 10 months of failure, because 2 sailors drowned retrieving documents from a sinking submarine without knowing why those documents mattered, because Alan Turing and his team worked 20-hour days for 10 months, testing combinations and calculating possibilities, and searching for the breakthrough that would restore their ability to read German communications, until finally they found the answer they had been seeking, and the darkness that had enveloped British intelligence operations for 10 terrible months only ended, and the Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively in favor of the Allies, and the war continued toward its eventual conclusion with the cryptographic advantage restored to those who had worked so hard to achieve it and preserve it against all obstacles. The scale of the intelligence operation at Bletchley Park during the blackout period deserves deeper examination because it represented one of the most intensive cryptographic efforts ever undertaken, with resources and personnel being poured into the problem at rates that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, when Britain was fighting for survival on multiple fronts. The staff at Bletchley Park grew from fewer than 200 people in 1939 to nearly 10,000 by 1945, with much of that expansion occurring during and immediately after the Enigma Blackout, as Churchill and the War Cabinet recognized that signals intelligence had become absolutely vital to British survival and allocated resources accordingly. The bomb machines themselves represented remarkable achievements in early computing technology, with each machine containing miles of wire and thousands of electrical contacts that had to work in perfect synchronization to test rotor positions systematically and identify possible solutions to daily key settings. The original bombs designed for three-rotor Enigma were already complex and temperamental devices requiring constant maintenance and adjustment, but the new machines designed specifically for four-rotor Enigma during the blackout period were even more sophisticated, incorporating additional rotors and faster processing capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible with 1940s electromechanical engineering. Building these new bombs required specialized manufacturing capabilities and precision components that were in short supply during wartime, with production facilities working around the clock to produce the drums and rotors and electrical contacts that formed the heart of each machine. And the fact that Britain managed to produce dozens of these sophisticated devices during a period when resources were stretched thin across every aspect of the war effort demonstrates the priority that had been assigned to breaking four-rotor Enigma. Each new bomb that came online represented an incremental increase in processing capacity, allowing more combinations to be tested more quickly. But even with dozens of machines running continuously, the key space remained so vast that success required not just computational power, but also the cribs and insights that came from captured documents. The human element of the cryptographic war extended far beyond the mathematicians and engineers working directly on Enigma at Bletchley Park, encompassing thousands of people in supporting roles that were equally essential to the intelligence operation, even if they never received the same recognition or understanding of how their contributions fit into the larger picture. The intercept stations scattered around Britain's coastline operated continuously, with radio operators monitoring German frequencies and recording every transmission they could detect, creating the raw material that Bletchley Park would attempt to decrypt. And these operators worked in isolated stations, often without knowing what they were listening for or why their work mattered, simply recording endless streams of encrypted messages that seemed meaningless but contained information that could save lives. The teleprinter operators who transcribed intercepted messages worked with similar dedication and similar ignorance of the larger context, converting audio recordings into written text that could be fed into the bombs for processing, maintaining accuracy while working at high speed, because errors in transcription could prevent decryption even when the correct rotor positions had been identified. The maintenance technicians who kept the bombs running worked impossible hours, replacing worn contacts and adjusting timing mechanisms and troubleshooting electrical faults, understanding that any machine downtime represented lost opportunities to break that day's keys and read time-sensitive intelligence about U-boat positions and convoy attacks. The impact of the intelligence blackout rippled through every level of British naval operations in ways that went beyond simple statistics of ships sunk and lives lost, affecting strategic planning, operational decisions, and tactical execution across the entire Atlantic theatre. Naval commanders who had grown accustomed to making decisions based on accurate intelligence about enemy submarine positions suddenly found themselves operating blind, forced to revert to older methods of convoy protection that were demonstrably less effective. And the psychological impact of this loss of capability was significant even beyond the material consequences of increased losses. Escort commanders who had been routing convoys around known U-boat concentrations with confidence now had to accept that every course decision was essentially a gamble, that they might be sailing directly into wolf packs without any warning. And this uncertainty affected morale and decision-making in subtle but important ways throughout the escort forces. Convoy commodores, the merchant marine officers responsible for maintaining formation and executing maneuvers, found themselves unable to trust that the routes they'd been assigned represented the safest passages, knowing that without intelligence those routes were simply guesses that might or might not avoid submarine concentrations. The merchant sailors themselves, who had been experiencing gradually improving survival rates as Enigma intelligence allowed better convoy protection, watched with growing alarm as losses began mounting again in the spring and summer of 1942. Not understanding why the situation had deteriorated so dramatically, but knowing that their chances of surviving a voyage had gotten significantly worse. some merchant ships made 5 or 6 Atlantic crossings during the blackout period, running the gauntlet repeatedly while losses mounted around them. And the psychological strain of repeated exposure to U-boat attacks without any apparent improvement in protection took a terrible toll on crews who were already working under incredibly difficult conditions. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Atlantic to affect planning for future operations throughout the European and Mediterranean theaters, because every major operation required shipping to transport troops and equipment and supplies. And if Britain couldn't maintain control of the Atlantic sea lanes, then those operations would become impossible regardless of how well they were planned or how many resources were allocated. The invasion of North Africa, scheduled for November 1942, represented a particularly critical dependency on Atlantic shipping, requiring hundreds of vessels to transport American troops and British forces to landing beaches in Morocco and Algeria. And military planners watched the mounting losses during the blackout with increasing concern about whether sufficient shipping would be available when needed. The decision to proceed with Operation Torch, despite the ongoing shipping crisis, represented a calculated risk by Allied leadership, betting that the invasion could be executed successfully, even while U-boats continued sinking merchant vessels at unsustainable rates. And if the Enigma Blackout had continued much longer, that bet might have failed with catastrophic consequences for Allied strategy. The timing of the breakthrough in December 1942, just weeks after the North Africa landings, represented extraordinary luck that allowed subsequent operations to proceed with gradually improving shipping availability as convoy losses declined, and new construction began replacing sunken tonnage. The German perspective on this period reveals interesting insights into how intelligence operations can succeed or fail based on assumptions and beliefs that may not reflect reality, because German naval commanders never fully understood why their successes in early 1942 gave way to increasing difficulties later in the war, attributing changes in Allied convoy behavior to improved technology or increased escort numbers, rather than recognizing that their communications were being read. Dönitz remained convinced throughout the war that Enigma was secure, that the mathematical complexity of the system made it impossible for the British to break even if they captured machines and codebooks, and this conviction prevented Germany from making additional security improvements that might have maintained their cryptographic advantage. The German cryptographic community's overconfidence in Enigma security represents a fascinating case study in how technical sophistication can create blind spots, because the system was indeed mathematically complex and would have been unbreakable using manual methods or even early mechanical calculators. But they failed to anticipate the development of specialized computing machinery like the bombs that could test combinations at speeds that made brute force approaches feasible when combined with cribs and captured materials. The addition of the fourth rotor in February 1942 represented the one significant security improvement Germany made during the war, and even that was motivated more by general paranoia about security than by any specific evidence that three-rotor Enigma had been compromised. The question of what would have happened if Germany had made additional security improvements beyond the fourth rotor raises uncomfortable counterfactuals for historians examining the war. Because if Dönitz had ordered more frequent changes to the encryption system, or implemented additional layers of security, or simply rotated codes more aggressively, the blackout period might have been extended indefinitely with potentially decisive consequences. Britain was extraordinarily fortunate that Germany made exactly one major security upgrade during the period when British cryptographers had the resources and determination to eventually overcome it, rather than implementing a series of rolling improvements that would have kept Bletchley Park perpetually behind the curve. The relationship between technology and intelligence in modern warfare became abundantly clear during the Enigma Blackout, demonstrating that superior technology alone couldn't guarantee victory if the enemy possessed intelligence advantages that allowed them to avoid or counter that technology effectively, while also showing that intelligence advantages could be negated by relatively simple technological changes that increased cryptographic complexity beyond the attacking side's computational capabilities. The Battle of the Atlantic ultimately represented a competition between Germany's submarine technology and Britain's anti-submarine technology, mediated through the intelligence war being fought at Bletchley Park and in German naval communications procedures. The long-term influence of the Enigma experience on post-war intelligence operations and cryptographic security cannot be overstated, because the lessons learned at Bletchley Park about the importance of signals intelligence and the vulnerability of encrypted communications directly inform the development of modern intelligence agencies and cryptographic practices. The creation of GCHQ in Britain and the expansion of NSA in America were directly influenced by wartime experiences with signals intelligence, while modern encryption standards explicitly account for the computational resources that adversaries might bring to bear against protected communications. The ethical dimensions of the Enigma story also deserve consideration, because the decision to allow some convoys to be attacked, rather than risk revealing that Enigma had been broken, represented a calculated trade of lives for strategic advantage that continues to provoke debate among historians and ethicists. The intelligence from Bletchley Park was so valuable that protecting the source became paramount, even when that meant accepting losses that might have been prevented if ultra-intelligence had been used more aggressively. And this tension between immediate tactical advantage and long-term strategic benefit required constant, difficult decisions by British leadership throughout the war. The memorial at Bletchley Park today commemorates not just Anthony Fasson and Colin Grazier, but all the individuals who contributed to breaking Enigma and maintaining that capability throughout the war, from the famous mathematicians like Alan Turing to the anonymous intercept operators who recorded thousands of messages without understanding their significance, recognizing that the intelligence victory required contributions from people at every level working together toward a common goal. The preservation of Bletchley Park as a historical site ensures that future generations can understand how this cryptographic battle was fought and won, learning lessons that remain relevant as encryption and code-breaking continue to evolve with advancing technology. Every year on October 30th, veterans gather at the memorial, their numbers declining as time passes, and the generation that fought the war ages and dies. But while they live, they remember the 10 months when U-boats were invisible to British intelligence, when convoys sailed blind into wolf-pack concentrations, when hundreds of ships died because the codes couldn't be broken. They remember the desperate work at Bletchley Park as cryptographers tested every approach they could imagine, the construction of new bombs that pushed the boundaries of contemporary technology, the tension as months passed without breakthrough, and finally, the capture of U-559's codebooks that provided the key to ending the blackout. They remember how it felt when the first four-rotor decrypt succeeded in December 1942, and ultra-intelligence came back online, restoring the advantage that had been lost 10 months earlier, and allowing convoy routing to be based once again on accurate knowledge of U-boat positions rather than guesswork and hope. They remember the subsequent reduction in losses as Enigma intelligence guided convoys around danger areas and directed escorts to vulnerable points, saving ships and lives through information rather than firepower, demonstrating that knowledge could be as powerful as weapons in determining the outcome of battles. The Enigma Blackout represents a unique moment in military history, when a purely cryptographic change the addition of a single rotor to an encryption machine created a crisis that threatened national survival and was ultimately resolved through a combination of mathematical brilliance, technological innovation, and individual courage that culminated in two sailors drowning while retrieving documents from a sinking submarine. The story encompasses elements of technology and intelligence and human courage that combine to illustrate how wars are won not just through superior forces or better weapons, but through information and the ability to use that information effectively to make better decisions than the enemy. The lessons remain relevant in an era when encryption and code breaking continue to evolve, with advancing computational capabilities and new mathematical approaches, because the fundamental dynamic of the Enigma Blackout continues to repeat in modern contexts where cryptographic security protects vital information and adversaries work constantly to penetrate that security through technical means or physical capture or exploitation of procedural weaknesses. The balance between encryption complexity and computational power that determined the outcome of the Enigma battle continues to shift as both sides develop new capabilities, ensuring that the cryptographic war that began at Bletchley Park will continue indefinitely into the future, with ever more sophisticated tools, but fundamentally unchanged stakes.